Okay, this is our first tutorial in Photoshop. We are using the software to create something that we could have done in Illustrator, but we're going to learn how to do the similar kind of thing in Photoshop and notice some of the differences between the software. Here's where we're going to end up at the end of today's lesson. We're going to create a sphere. We're going to use highlights and shadows to make it look realistic, give it some depth. We're going to use gradient. We're going to use the selection tools, and we're going to learn a little bit about layers and how those work in Photoshop. All right, so to get started, we're going to open up Photoshop. We're going to create a new file. So start by opening Command N or File, New, and then from here we're going to go over to Web. You have some options here. For now, we'll start off with the Web Large option, 1920 by 1080. This shows up here. We have the option of changing our orientation to be horizontal or vertical. We're going to stick with this for now, and we're going to hit Create. Here's our blank canvas. What you're going to notice if this is your first time using Photoshop in my class, you'll notice that there's a lot of similarities between Illustrator and Photoshop, at least in terms of the interface. There's going to be some differences for sure, but you'll start to recognize some tools and hopefully the crossover between the two softwares. First of all, the first thing we're going to do every time we start up the software is we're going to open up our workspace and change our essentials palette or our essentials workspace and reset our essentials workspace. That puts everything back to where it was when we started using the software so that your your interface, your software looks like the video and you can find things. A couple of things we're going to turn off and set to be the same as my software. We're going to click on this first tool, making sure it's active. We're going to turn off the auto select and we're going to turn off the show transform controls. I'll show you what those do later in the lesson, but for now we want these both unchecked. This one, and they only show up when you have the move tool selected. So make sure that you have that tool selected. Turn this off, turn this off. Okay, great. So first of all, we are going to look at selection. So selection tells Photoshop what do I care about on my artboard. I've got an artboard here. I've got, notice in my layers palette down here, okay, we've got we've got an artboard and then we've got layers. Notice that I can select my artboard or I can select my layer. I want to have my layer or I can select neither of them. I want to have my layer selected, okay, and it turns light gray when I click on it. That means that I'm going to be drawing. If I have nothing selected, it won't work. Some of the tools will act funny. So click on that. We're going to go to this tool here and notice that when I click and hold, I get a couple of options here. Okay, rectangle, elliptical, and single marquee, horizontal and vertical. We're going to go with elliptical for now. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to hold Shift to lock that to a circular selection. I still have keep my mouse button selected, my mouse button pressed down, which means I can continue to make changes. I can also, while I'm holding my mouse button down and my Shift button down to keep it a perfect circle, I can hold space bar with another finger and I can reposition my anchor point, like my kind of registration point, right? So if I want it to be here and have my circle over here, I hold spacebar, I can reposition, let go of spacebar, and then make this bigger or smaller as I need to. When I'm happy with my position and size, I'm going to let go of my mouse and then let go of Shift. Okay, if you do that out of order, so say I make my ellipse, I hold Shift, and then if I let go of Shift first, notice it stops being a perfect circle, and when I let go, I've got an oval. That's not what I want, okay? I want hold Shift, get a perfect circle, let go of my mouse, and then let go of Shift. All right, notice that when I put my cursor inside this little dotted selection here, I can pick up and move my selection to where I want, but if I click outside of it, notice the cursor changes. Inside lets me move it. Outside is going to deselect it. Okay, so whenever I have any selection, if I click outside, it deselects that selection. And we'll talk about what a selection is in a minute, but just understand that you can get rid of it by clicking outside. You can also do the same thing by going Select, Deselect, or Command D on your keyboard. Okay, so there's our selection. I'm going to reposition it where I want it. And you'll see these pink lines showing up. These are just smart guides. We'll talk about those later as well. Okay, so got my selection. This little kind of dashed line, which seems to be moving. We call that either a selection or commonly it's referred to as marching ants because it looks like a bunch of little ants on their way to a picnic. And you can see it's moving slightly. This just tells Photoshop here, or it tells you where your selection is. What does that mean? Well, if I click on the brush tool and I start drawing, I'm going to actually set this down to a small size. If I start drawing, what you'll notice is it's only drawing in the selected area because I've told Photoshop that this is the part I care about. If I deselect, select, deselect, and now start drawing, it'll draw wherever I draw. There's no selection, so then Photoshop doesn't uh, specify any place in particular. Okay, so I'm going to go to my history palette, which is here, or window history. Okay, it's going to pop open this, and you can see that I can go back in my steps. I'm going to go back to the point before I did that brush. So then I'm back here where I have my elliptical marquee, and I've removed these elements. As soon as I go and draw something else, it overwrites that history. So anything I do differently, if I select a deselect, it's going to overwrite my history in my history palette, and it changes what I did. Okay, all right. So what I want to do in this lesson is I want to start with some color. So we're going to be creating a gradient inside of this space. The reason I've made a selection is if I didn't have a selection, let's deselect this, and I made a gradient, it would fill the entire screen just like we did when we were using our brush tool. So make sure that we have that selection made, then we're limiting the effect to this space. Let's pick a color. We're going to click over down here. And in fact, the first thing we're going to do is if you haven't done this yet, while you have the brush selected, you can do this with a couple of tools, but we'll do it with the brush. We're going to reset our tools. So here next to the house icon, the home icon, you'll see the brush tool, which is whatever tool you have selected. We're going to click on this little chevron here, the little drop down, and we're going to go to the gear setting. Now you don't have to do this every time, but for the first time you're doing this software with the lesson, I want you to reset all tools. What that's going to do is going to set the preferences back to the default settings. That means that things like, so notice when I click on this move tool, it has turned these back to checked. Okay, so we don't need to do that every time, but I do want to do it in this situation because I want your tools to do exactly what my tools do. So I am going to uncheck this again. I'd like you to do the same thing, and then we're going to continue with what we're doing. What we're doing is we're going to look at the gradient tool. So this is here. It may be, depending on your setup, it may have the paint bucket tool here. Okay, we want to have the gradient tool. So make sure that of these two, if you don't see it, notice that it may be missing. If you can't find it, if you hit G on your keyboard, it'll select the tool that you want, and then you can find the gradient here. Now, let's take a look at what's happening. We have some options. Notice along the top here, you have sub-menus. So when I click on any tool, I get a bunch of kind of sub-menu items here. So when I'm in the gradient, I get tools for the gradient. You may recognize some of these from, if you've used Illustrator before, you'll recognize the types of gradient. Here we have a linear gradient, which means it moves in a line, a radial, and some others that I don't very often use, and some other settings. We'll come back to these in a minute. We also have the drop down here that says gradient or classic gradient. We're going to use, for now, the classic gradient. We will, in a minute, look at what the gradient does and how it's different. But for now, for this lesson, classic gradient is a little simpler, so we're going to do that. From there, we're going to click on this little drop down here, and you'll see that you have a number of options. So when I open this up, we're going to skip basics for now. You're going to see that you have blue gradients and purple gradients, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, there's lots here, but we actually want to be really specific about what we want. We're going to be using the basics. Now, what's happening here is it's using my selected colors, black and white. If you have used Illustrator before, you'll recognize this, but it works slightly differently in Photoshop. We're going to be using these as foreground and background colors, and those two colors are going to affect our gradient. So right now, black and white, you can see it's going black to white. Again, on the right here, black to white, and then this one is going black to these little checkerboards, and we'll see what that means in a minute. First of all, let's change our color. So double click this black box here, and it's going to open up a color picker. Let's choose a color. We're going to go with like a yellowy green, something like this, and we're going to hit OK. And then I want to select my background color. So notice it changed here. Oops, sorry, cancel that. It changed here from my foreground color to white, foreground to those checkers, and black to white. So these two have been affected by the changes that I made. Okay, we're going to do a similar thing. I'm going to click on this, which is now going to choose my background color. Notice here, it says color picker background. If I click this one here, the foreground color, it tells me specifically I'm changing my foreground color. Okay, we want background, so I'm going to click here. And I want to sample the green that I used here. So notice that when I put my cursor anywhere on the screen, I get this eyedropper, and I can put it over the screen and it'll pick up that green and sample the exact color that I was using. That gives me a good starting point. And then what I want to do is I want to pick a related green, but much darker. So we're going to go down to there and hit OK. If you're trying to get the exact colors that I used, you can use the hex value here. Okay, input that number and it'll give you the number that I used. Okay, we'll hit OK there. Notice the changes. Foreground to background color, foreground to these checkerboards, black to white. Now, let's just quickly talk about what the difference between these two are. Foreground to background just basically goes foreground color to background color. These check boxes here, or these little checkers, mean that there's a transparency. There's nothing at this point. We're going to use this later in the lesson, but for now, understand that this is just saying go to from my foreground color to transparent. Okay, so that's what those are, and this default is always black to white. Okay, linear gradient. You don't have to do this, just watch. The linear gradient is going to make a linear gradient. I gotta click here on my layer. It does a straight line from where I first click to where I let go. It goes from the first foreground color to the background color in a straight line. Okay, I'm going to undo that, Command Z. I'm going to change this to a radial gradient. That's going to start in the center where I first click and let go. It's going to make a circular or a radial gradient that moves out from the starting point to the end point of my click. I'm going to undo that, Command Z. If I make a bigger line, it'll go from the center to where I finish clicking, and that's a larger gradient. I'm going to undo that. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to start up at the top left and click down to the bottom right, leaving a little bit of space here so we're not right at the edge. We want to come in by a little bit. I'm going to click and drag, and we're going to let go here. And this should create a radial gradient from foreground color to background color using the colors that we selected, and that should look a little bit like a sphere. Okay, so not bad. That looks kind of like what we're going for. Notice that our history window is being updated each time we do something. Okay, and so I can go back through my history to the steps, and as long as I don't make a change, I can go forward back to where I was. Okay, so there's my steps, and keep in mind that this history is only relevant in the session that you're using. So if I save this, if I go file and I save this work and then I close it and then I reopen the file, your history will not be here from previous saves and closes. It only works in the session that you're working in. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If you are saving your work and leaving class or you're done with something, be sure that you're happy with it because you won't have this accessed later. Okay, we're continuing with our gradient. Let's rename our logo or our layer here. So we've got this called layer 1. If I double click the word layer 1, it's going to let me rename this. Notice if I click outside of the actual word, if I click here, it's going to open up layer style property palettes, and I don't want that for now. So let's cancel that. Don't click over here, click on the actual word. Okay, and we're going to call this sphere. All right, that's our kind of starting point. We still have this selection here because we never got rid of it. And so what that means is it's telling us that if I make any changes, those are going to happen inside that selection because I told Photoshop that's what I care about. So don't do this, but just watch. If I click my brush and I change this to be black, if I click this, it sets my colors back to default colors, and I start drawing, it's going to draw only in that area. Okay, I don't want that, so I'm going to undo that by going in my history, but just understand that drawing outside of it will not affect outside of that selection because that selection is limited. Okay, we're now going to create a new layer. So down in my layer palette over here, I'm going to go to the very bottom, there's a little plus icon, and we're going to create a new layer. On that layer, we're going to be creating a little bit of a shadow, kind of some highlights and shadows on our sphere to make it look a little bit more realistic. First of all, let's double click this and we're going to name this layer highlight, HL for highlight. Okay, and then hit enter. And we're going to start off with our brush tool. So go to the brush tool. And if you haven't done it already, I want you to reset your colors to black and white. D on your keyboard will do the same thing. And we're going to flip them so that instead of black on the foreground and white on the background, I'm going to flip them so white is on the foreground. That means I'm going to be drawing with white. Okay, undo that, Command Z to undo. And I want to use a brush with a big fat kind of tip. So I'm going to bring my brush size up to 500 and hit enter. and notice that the hardness is going to stay at 0. Let me just quickly demonstrate what that does. So if you don't have to do this, just watch. Bring this down to 200 and I use a soft brush. It gives me softened edges. If I change that brush to 100% hardness, it's going to give me hard edges on my brush. So those two brush strokes are the same thing, except one has soft edges, one has hard edges. And if I undo that, Command Z, and I go somewhere in the middle, if I change that to 50% hardness, okay, it's going to do kind of a similar thing, but with soft edges, but not as soft as 0. Command Z, undo. Okay, so these brush settings give me some choice. 500 for our size and 0 for our hardness. And we're going to just be, click off of that. We're going to click here on this layer. Now notice we still have our selection here. So our highlight is going to be limited to this space. So even if I don't do this, just watch. If I did this in black and I clicked outside of this, notice that it's not doing anything outside of this shape because I've limited it to the space because of my selection. Okay, so that's what we want, except we want to do it in white. So you have your white selected, you have your brush selected, you have your settings, and I'm going to click here. It's going to create a nice specular highlight on our highlight layer. The next thing we're going to do is going to create another layer. Okay, we're going to put this layer here. We're going to move down to the, actually, no, we'll leave it here. We're going to add a little bit of a shadow on our sphere here. So we need to switch this over to black. Okay, we can hit default if you need to, change that to black. And we're going to do a similar thing that we did before, which is kind of draw on this space. But instead of keeping our selection like we have now, we're going to go select, deselect. So once we do that, notice that wherever I draw, it's going to draw anywhere because we have no longer created a selection. So I want to undo that. Command Z. I'm going to undo that or do it in your history palette here. And what I want to do is I want to use the selection that I have from that sphere where we have transparency, and I want to use that to affect my available space here. So I could try and take a selection like this and try and get the circle right again, but I'm probably not going to get it exactly right. I'm going to be off by a little, and you can see down here, I'm a little bit off, and I don't want that. I want it to be exact. So I'm going to select, deselect, Command 1 to go to 100%, and I'm going to use this sphere to give myself a new selection. So on your keyboard, I want you to hold the Command key and click on the thumbnail. As soon as you hold the Command key, you'll see you get this little box that shows up. I'm going to click here, and what you'll see is my marching ants show up again. And what it did, it was selected the place on this layer that has pixels. So if I did the same thing on the next layer, the highlight layer, if I hold Command on my keyboard and I click here, it'll select the area that has pixels on this layer. Okay, so by doing that, I'm going to again go back to the sphere here. I actually want this one. So by doing that, I've now selected where the sphere is. So when I draw on this layer, my active layer, it's going to limit it to that space. I'm drawing with my brush tool. I've got my settings, black brush, 500 as my size and softness. And I'm just going to kind of draw a little bit of a crescent there to create a bit of shadow. Now, that does seem a little bit dark. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring the opacity of this layer down a little bit. So notice here, while this layer is selected and I change this opacity down, it's going to change how dark this layer is, okay? And so what's happening there is I set it down to, let's say 20. This layer is now showing at 20%. And so if I turn these off, you'll see that this now is a 20% opacity compared to how dark it was before. Okay, so we're going to set that to 20 and we're happy with that. We'll turn these guys back on. And now we have a little bit of darker shadow. Say I want that to be a little darker still, I could do a couple things. First of all, let's rename this. I'm going to double click the name and call that shadow. Actually, we're going to call it shade because we're going to also do another one called shadow. This is kind of be the dark spot on our circle or our sphere. Say I want this to be a little bit darker. I could, as you probably figured out, I could drag this up, or I could also duplicate the layer by dragging it down to the plus, and it gives me a copy of that layer. This means that I can now affect these independently. I can make this one say 50%, 50%, 51, and I could, make this 20% or whatever. So depending on what you're in this case, that doesn't make sense because they're both exactly the same thing. But you do have the ability to duplicate layers and change how these things interact. We'll be doing this with effects later in this tutorial, but just so you understand, the opacity affects the layer that you're on, okay? And it's specific to that layer. So when I turn all these off, you see this one is set at 51, and this one is set at 20, and they work independently, but they also multiply against each other depending on how you use those. Okay, let's turn that back on. We're going to get rid of this because we don't need two of them. We're going to try, drag that down to the garbage. Okay, that gets rid of that one. And we're going to turn this one off for now because we're going to try and do the same thing another way, just so we can learn some more of these available tools. So first, let's go to our brush tool. Make sure that brush is selected. I'm going to create a new layer again. This time I'm going to double click the layer name and we're going to call this 20% brush. All right. With my brush selected, notice up here in my tools where I changed the size and hardness, I have got some other settings as well. This we will ignore for now, but return to later. Here on our opacity slider, we can drag this down to whatever percentage we want. And when I draw in black, it works at 100%. But if I undo that, Command Z, I bring this down to 20%, right there, 20. Okay, and now it's going to draw at 20%. So it's doing the same kind of thing I did before, except instead of bringing the opacity of the layer down, I'm using the brush at a lower opacity. So I'm going to undo that. I don't actually want it there. And I want to draw here. Okay, and I can do a couple of passes, right? And so what I did there is I did kind of 3 brush tool passes, which gave me kind of a 60%, excuse me, gave me a 60% opacity, but because I've got that soft edge brush up here, it's kind of softening or feathering those edges, which gives me kind of more control. And then you can decide which you think looks better, or if you want to use them in combination, depending on how that works. Okay, so far things are looking pretty good. I'm going to leave all those layers on. You can turn these on and off as you please, and you can also turn this brush down if you feel that that works better at, say, 60%. If you felt it was too dark, you have that control as well. Let's deselect our selection. Select and deselect to get rid of our marching ants. A couple of things to note. We have 4 layers. We can continue to move these up and down. So keep in mind that by dragging these layers up and down, this will move forward and backward in my stacking order, just like in Illustrator. Previously, we did this. And so I'm going to put the highlight to the top and have these in that order. Excuse me. Continuing, we're going to now add a shadow as if the light that is shining on this is going to cast a shadow into the background. So let's create a new layer. We're going to call this shadow. And we're going to drag it to the very back. Notice if you drag this down, for some reason, if you drag it too far, like down here, it pops it out. So notice that this is no longer indented like these are, right? It kind of pulled it out of the artboard. So just be aware that I want to pull it down to this point and let go and keep it in line. If I pull it down too far, what happens is it pulls it off of the artboard. So it's no longer included in the artboard here. And I want this on the artboard. So drag this in here and make sure that that stays indented like that. Okay, the shadow is going to be behind this. And we want that shadow to kind of fall on this white kind of background here. So let's go to our elliptical marquee tool, and we're going to click and drag a selection that's about 1/3 of the height of this sphere and about, let's say, 140% width. Okay, looks like that. All right, and let's take a look at what we can do here. So with this selection, just like the one that we did previously, we can move it around if we need to by putting our cursor inside of that space and moving it. We're going to put this here. We're going to move it afterwards. Okay, so for now, just put it anywhere, and we're going to fill this space in. Reset my colors. Edit. Fill. With this drop down here, we have some options. We're going to change this from content aware down to black. Okay, we could use a foreground color because right now we have it set at black, but just know that you can click black here. And I hit OK. And what's going to happen is it's going to fill this selection in with a black color. Okay, I'm going to pull this up to the top to show you how that looks. Okay, that's just basically filled in and it creates our shadow. Now the problem is that's a very harsh shadow. It looks kind of unrealistic. If I go select, deselect, looks more like a hole. So we're going to edit what we did there and make it a little bit of a change. Let's go back in our layer order, or sorry, our history to right before we filled this. We're gonna go to our selection here. And we're gonna make a change to how that selection is. Instead of having hard edges, we can do a similar thing to what we did with our brush tool. The way that we had hard edged brush and a soft edge brush, we can do the same thing with our selection tool. We're going to go up to, once we've made our selection like this, we're gonna go to select and then modify, and then we're gonna feather our selection by, let's say, 40 pixels. Okay, I hit OK, and it won't look like it made much of a change. But now when I go edit, fill, and I choose black from the drop down, I say OK. Notice it gives me these soft edges. Okay, so that gives me the opportunity, and I'm gonna select, deselect, so you can see what that looks like. Okay, that gives me kind of that softer shadow. That's not even actually soft as I want it. So I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to do it again. I went right back before feather. I'm going to go a little softer here. Select, modify, feather. Let's make that 50. See how that looks. Edit, fill with black, and that looks better. Now, I want to notice something here. I'm going to go to my move tool. If I need to move this, because the selection is softened, when I go to move this, sometimes depending on how you've selected it, it may leave a little bit of a rim around it. It won't select everything. And I think, I'm not sure if I can duplicate this, but I've seen students do this. So if I go select, deselect, and then I try and reselect this by holding Command and click here, if I go to move it, let's see if that worked. Hold on. It didn't actually did a pretty good job. So it's kind of selected the piece that I wanted, but I have seen students in the past where it kind of left a little bit of a rim there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go select, deselect, and then when I move it, it's going to move a little more clearly. Okay. Now I'm notice here that because I made my selection, when I made it, I'm going to go back a couple of steps. Because my soft feather here is so close to the edge, notice what happened when I moved it. When it was here, it was okay, but um, the feathered fill only went up to the edge here, so it's leaving this weird kind of cut here. So I'm actually going to redo all of this. I'm going to go Command A to select everything by going Command A is like select all here. Okay, I'm going to delete that. Delete on my keyboard, and I'm going to remake this. So you don't have to do this if yours is working, but if you had a weird little cut like that, I'm going to do this in the center so it's not getting cut off. So again, I've got my selection. I'm going to go select, modify feather, set that to 50. That's okay. I'm going to go edit, fill, and fill it with black, and then select and deselect. Okay, and that's going to give me a little bit of a better, kind of better edges. That looks better. Okay, I'm gonna bring this up to the top so you can see it. Right, and there's nothing cut off in there because I did in the center. Okay, now I can bring this down if I need to and do a couple things. I can bring my opacity down if I feel like I need that, okay, depending on how hard or soft I want that to be or how opaque I want that to be. But before we do that, we're actually going to edit something. So let's put this back down below sphere. And it looks a little too round. If the light is kind of coming from this direction, it kind of feels like it's coming from like in front of this ball and should be kind of fading off into the background. So we're going to do a little transformation here. We're going to change the way this thing works. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. I'll show you one and we'll do some more later. But for now, let's go to edit. No, hold on. Where is it? Yeah, edit. I'm going to go down to transform and we're going to go to distort. Now, let me show you what a couple of these things do before we move forward. Scale is going to do exactly what you think it's going to do. It's going to make it bigger and smaller. Rotate is going to allow me to rotate the object. Skew, I'll show you what that does. Okay, so when I pick this up, it just kind of changes the angle of the top of this thing. Okay, so it's kind of skewing it into, what is that, a parallelogram or some kind of shape? I don't know, ask a math teacher. Okay, so that's not what I want, so I'm going to undo that and hit escape and get rid of that. What I want to do is I want to go edit, transform, and I want to go to transform. I want to go to distort. Distort is going to let me change each of these independently. Okay, so with some of the transform tools, you don't have the same kind of control. So let me hit cancel on this. If I went edit, transform, and I went scale, it only allows me to scale it. Okay, and I can't make changes to the shape. It stays in this rectangle, and the ratio of sizing stays the same. If I hold shift, it'll let me squish it, but I can't pick up a corner and skew it. And what I want to do is skew it. So I'm going to hit escape, and I'm going to go again, edit, transform, and I'm going to go to distort. Now I can pick up individual pieces, and that's actually what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this top one here, bring it down this way, and we're just kind of trying to make it look like that light is kind of falling off in that direction. I'm going to move this over to here, and you can play with this until it kind of feels right to you. Once you're happy with it, you're going to hit checkbox, the check mark here. If you kind of messed it up and it doesn't look right, you can cancel and restart, but I'm happy with that. I'm going to turn that to kind of solidify that. Now, that does seem quite a harsh shadow to me, so I'm going to bring this down to, let's say, 70%, like that. And then I'm going to duplicate this layer. So I'm going to drag this down to the plus, so I have my second shadow. And just for now, let me move it off here so you can see what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring this down in size. I'm going to go Edit, Transform, and I can scale this, bring it down to about this big, and then I'm going to position it again in here, and it's going to create a little bit of a harsher shadow close, and then the one in the background here, which is just at 70%, oops, here, is just going to create a bit more of a fall off. So these two in combination make it look a little more realistic. Okay, if you want to, you can also rotate each of these. So if I click on this and I went Edit, Transform, Rotate, I can turn this until I'm kind of happy with the positioning, right? And that looks half decent to me. I'm going to use my arrow keys on my keyboard to kind of move it up. Okay, and if I go one at a time, it moves 1 pixel. If I hold shift, it'll move 10 pixels. So if I need to move it a little further, okay, that'll give me some control. And that looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with that. I'm going to kind of leave that the way that is. So a couple things to check. Make sure that you've named your layers. Okay, we want to get in the habit of naming our layers as we go through, and we're going to save our work when we're done with this, so that we have all of that saved in our file. And once you're done with this, you're going to save both your Photoshop document and your JPEG. So let's take a look at what that means. We have in the past in Illustrator, we had AI files, which were our Illustrator files, and then we would output a PNG. In Photoshop, if I say save as, we have the option here to do a Photoshop document, which is going to give me a PSD. So if I save this as a Photoshop document, it'll give me, here's an example, bowling ball PSD. Okay, that's a Photoshop document. Okay, and you can see that up here. So we're going to call this sphere. Okay, and then we're going to save it, and that's going to save our file. Asks if it's some format options, you just say okay to that, and that's now our authoring file. This will maintain all of my layers. We also need a file to put on our Wix website, so we're going to here file, we're going to export, and we're just going to do an export as, okay, export as, and we're going to choose PNG from this drop down here, okay, PNG, and we will hit export. We can leave all the settings fine. This is all okay. In fact, if we're doing this for Wix, we can bring this down. It doesn't need to be so big. So let's bring this down to, let's say, we'll call it 1,000. Even that's too much. Let's call it 800. Okay, we're going to call that 800, and that will automatically change this to 450. And then when I export it, it's going to give me a new file. I'm going to call this sphere. Keep the .png part because that is important. You'll have two files called sphere. One will be your sphere PSD, one will be your sphere PNG. And when I hit export, it's going to save that file. If I open up my Finder here and look in my tutorial sphere, here are my two files. One is my PSD, which is my authoring file. There's my PNG, which is my edited, my exported image. That'll go on Wix. This gets saved to make edits later. All right, we're done with the first portion of this lesson. The next piece we want to do is we're going to build on this and try and make a bowling ball. The bowling ball should have 3 circles, okay, that are the kind of the finger holes. And this is going to be a little bit of a challenge. So we're going to try and do this on our own. I'm going to get you started, and then you're going to see if you can finish it. So the things you should consider are, I'm going to make a new layer, so I'm not drawing on these, and I'm going to call this finger hole 1, and I'm going to try and make a selection that looks like a finger hole. I can, if I want it perfectly round, I'm going to hold shift, and if I want it to be a little bit oblong, or warped in one way or the other, I can make it a little bit of an oval. Okay, it's kind of hard to see, but I'm going to hit my magnifying glass here and zoom in, and you can see hopefully that that's a little bit wider than it is tall. And with a selection like this, I can actually go and transform my selection. So I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to go Transform Selection. Where is it? Hang on. No, it's under Selection. Sorry, Select, and I'm going to go here, Transform Selection. So now what I can do is I can rotate this until it's in the position that I want. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to say OK. Now my oval selection is kind of on an angle, because if you think about, this is a sphere, this is going to be a little bit angled. And I'm going to fill this by going Edit, Fill with black. And now it looks like, a hole. Okay, that's a little too small. Hold on, give me one. All right, so that's not bad. What I might want to do is add in a little bit of light. So that feels a little bit too dark. There would still be a bit of light in here. So maybe I'm going to go to my brush tool, and I'm going to pick up the color that we're using maybe down here. So I'm going to go to the eyedropper tool, which is here. And instead of using black, I'm going to pick up a dark green, maybe there. And then with my brush and with my selection still here, I want to keep that selection here so when I draw, I'm only affecting inside that place. Okay, with my brush tool, and I may send my opacity down, 20% probably good. And I'm just going to click in here, not doing much. I'm going to bring my size down a little bit. Okay, so I'm starting to just add in, and that might be too dark. Maybe I need a little bit of a lighter green. So I'm going to go eyedropper, pick up something a bit brighter, brush tool. That's too much. I'm just going to add in a little bit of color, okay, as if some light was entering this finger hole, okay? And you may want to work on this and spend some time getting it right, but we're trying to make this look like a hole. All right, once we're done with that, I'm going to let you guys work on the remaining finger holes. When you're done with it, I'm going to go select, deselect, okay? And when you're done, you're going to go File. You're going to save your file. You should keep a copy of this. So we have one called Sphere. We're going to go Save As. In the same place that you're naming things, we're going to call this one Bowling Ball. Okay, we'll keep a PSD and a PNG, which you can export by going File, Export, Export As. Okay, that's the lesson. Good luck, and we'll move on to the next lesson after this.